All right, 1 second here. All right, welcome everyone. We want to welcome everyone to this Q&A. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this Q&A. So something came up that I did promise I was going to hit in this Q&A. We'll see what else comes up after that. And the question wasn't really a question per se. It was more, I don't know, I'd say it's more like an outlook. I would say a false outlook, but an outlook nonetheless, how to look at certain things. So this certain thing was about end of life issues. Now, end of life issues are very complex. Not every situation is the same. So I want to kind of deal with it, just in general. But there's a question: to what extent does the person, have an obligation to? Well, the case really was about a tracheotomy, but in general, what's the obligation that a person has in end of life situation? Now, if in general, if it's something that's going to save the person's life, 100%, you have to save their life. If it's something where prolonging their life is going to cause more pain, then I don't have to do it. Right? We say shev al taseh. I don't do anything. And the reason you don't do anything is relatively simple, because let's say it's a terminal case. Yeah, so I don't have to go through heroics, right, in order to do something, right, to prolong life, especially if it's going to cause pain. Now, if something, again, in general, is already done, let's say the person can't breathe, put them on a respirator, let's say they do a tracheotomy. Now, if they're on a ventilator in general, and that's the only thing, keeping them alive. So according to many rabbinic authorities, if that's the only thing keeping them alive, because they're not really alive per se, the heart is beating, okay. So the question, can I take them off the ventilator in order to see, if they can breathe on their own, right? Now, that's when they're on the ventilator. Now, there's a question putting them on the ventilator itself. Now, the fact is, the person can't breathe, let's say, you put in, you do a tracheotomy in general. But, in this case, if you pull out the trach, what's going to happen? Most likely the person will die. Why? They can't breathe. So there's a major difference, if the thing has been put in or it hasn't been put in. And it's going to vary, case by case, where the person's holding, how sick they are, is it terminal, right? So one thing to keep in mind is that the general rule is there's a mitzvah to preserve life, right? What we call pikuach nefesh, that if a person's life is in danger, you're required to do whatever it takes to save them. You can desecrate Shabbos, right? You can desecrate a festival. You don't need necessarily to do it through a non-Jew. If there's no non-Jew around, you do it yourself. You do whatever it takes in general to save a life. Now, by a tracheotomy in general, if it's going to save a person from imminent death, in other words, if they don't do it, they'll die. And doing it is going to give them, the ability to live. Yeah, then according to Jewish law, that'd be a good thing. You'd be obligated to do it, right? You'd be obligated to do it. Let's say, again, it's, going to help a person. The question comes in, and that's why I bring this up. We'll go further in a second. Is that some may say what's the level of quality of life? Now, I haven't spoken about this before, and that's why I flush it out, speak about all the nuances or many of the nuances. But in this case, right? In this case, someone is going to say, in general, again, we're not taking what I'm saying over here, is the final, the final thing. Speaking in generalities here, right? Someone is going to potentially claim this person, if you do X, Y, or Z, that's not quality of life. Now, according to who? And what's the definition of quality of life? If you tell me they're in a situation, their situation is terminal, they're never going to get better. Yeah. You can say doctors can make mistakes. Okay, but let's say for argument's sake, they get it right. Person's got it, stage 4, stage 5 of, X disease, whatever it is. It's terminal. The only question is, how long it's going to take. Some may take shorter amount of time. Some maybe a little bit longer amount of time. In either case, terminal. Yeah. Now, if something is terminal and it's going to cause the person to suffer, cause them more pain, I don't have to do it, right? I don't have an obligation to do it. Now, if it's already been done, again, this is a different question, but there are two things here. There are two things here. One is the main thing we're speaking about is the question whether, how far you have to go to save someone's life. Yeah, what the obligations are in general. And there's a whole other issue, a whole other moral issue. And the moral issue is that some people, doctors included, will say, well, they're not going to have quality of life. And if they're not going to have quality of life, then there's no point. Yeah, that's very problematic, extremely problematic, because if a person's alive, yeah, let's say a person's paralyzed, can't get out, can't do very much, but they're alive. Yeah, so someone say, well, I would never want to live that way. Okay, that's not quality of life. Now, according to them, what's quality of life? You're up, you're doing things, you're active. So, again, more active, less active, but you're active. Doing whatever, you could be doing stupid things, nonsensical type of things, but you're active. That's called quality of life. Yeah. If a person was blind and couldn't hear and they can't watch, a sporting event, that quality of life. I mean, how far does this go? We could go to the absurd over here. But it's not a small issue. Yeah, and and the definition might be a little bit broad, in a certain way. But the way the secular world, this is how really, it came up. Because, some may say, well, forget about Jewish law. Well, what about goes on in the secular world? We don't care what goes on in the secular world. Jewish law affects us, right? It's that, it's the meat and potatoes of what Torah is. What I'm obligated to do, not obligated to do, how I'm obligated to do it. What do I care? What do I give a rat's tail what the secular world says? About anything in general. Yeah, but it's a very, very touchy issue. Because there are plenty of places, that will try and convince a person, like, don't do heroics. And they'll bring, people in, palliative care people in to convince them to die. Yeah, I know the story, and not personally, but someone wrote up about a story that a parent was sick, had cancer, they're in the hospital, and basically they don't want to treat them. They didn't want to treat them, and they were deteriorating, and basically trying to convince his patient, like, not to do very much. And the person was deteriorating. So this person went to their regular doctor. They said, listen, if you don't take them out of the hospital, they're gonna die, right? They are gonna kill them, essentially. So they did what they needed to do, got them out of the hospital. They recovered, and they lived another 10 years. another 10 years, right? So again, it depends on a number of factors. Yeah. If it's terminal, not terminal, and what can be done for this person. But who defines, and this is really what irks me, and that is, who gives anyone the right to define what quality of life is? This is what bothers me. Yeah. Because it can't, like someone had stroke, someone said the kid ain't play Sudoku. Like, that's quality of life. Can't do crossword puzzle. Well, this person's always sitting lying there. Okay. Nothing like extreme pain, per se. Can't do very much. Person's paralyzed. I know, a case like this. A person's very old. Okay. That's all quality of life. So kill him. Again, forget about the halachic aspects here. The philosophical thing before we get to that. So you have a right to push them over a cliff, shoot them in the head. If they have tracheotomy in, you pull it out. That's painful enough, but okay, let's say you take it out. Yeah, so ask somebody, what's going to happen if you take that trach out? They'll suffocate. Very good. That's murder. You're not allowed to do that. Question to give them one, that's a different issue. That's a different issue. But again, the problem is, who gives anyone the right to say what quality of life is? Okay, person's paralyzed, can't move, can't do very much. Okay, they're very old. Okay, so what do? Kill them? Well, I can never live like that. Well, too bad. Not question whether you could, you couldn't. Do you have a right to terminate that person or not? Right? That's the question. The answer is no. Under most circumstances. We call that, no matter how it's done, we call that murder. Yeah. So now the question is, right? What are we talking about over here? See if the intervention, let's say, very burdensome, painful, prognosis poor, right? Prognosis is extremely poor over here. And the procedure you're doing is going to prolong suffering. They might say, okay, maybe that's still okay. But the question is, what if they're never going to recover? This is terminal. They're not going to recover. So if that is the case, in general, again, this is case by case thing over here. But if that would be the case, many rabbinic authorities say there's no obligation. There's no absolute obligation. And therefore, it may be permissible to delay or forego life-prolonging therapy. That's one thing. Yeah, the case is, if it's somebody who's terminally ill, then we're going to say that life-extending measures are not mandated. Why? Because the person's terminal. You don't want them to suffer anymore. So according to Jewish law, some say forbidden. Who gives us the right to prolong someone who's suffering? They're supposed to die, so let them die. Why prolong it? Right? I don't have to go out of my way to do something to prolong life. Maybe forbidden. Right? If they're terminally ill and there's no chance of recovery. They're going to say, well, there are different opinions. There can be different opinion among doctors. Okay, there could be. But let's say 100% everybody agrees. They got 5 different opinions, they all say the same thing. You'll say, but God could change a person's status overnight. You're right. As we say, Yeshua's Hashem Karafayim, salvation of God come with the blink of an eye. Man. Okay, but in this case, no. In this case, according to nature, we don't rely on miracles. Another important thing, right? If God's the ultimate healer, right? So there are different ways to look at it here, right? Some will say, if God is the ultimate healer, what do I have to go to a doctor? It's another issue, right? Now, if a person's on an unbelievably high spiritual level, which no one is today, person gets sick, you go to a doctor. If a person relies on God for every last thing they do, they don't, person doesn't work. They learn all day, so God will provide, but they're in a high, very high level of emunah, of faith and belief in God. So, okay, things work differently for them. But if at any time they put their best foot forward, whether it comes to livelihood, whether it comes to seeing a doctor, they don't have a right to say, I'm going to rely on God, right? That's forbidden. So, when it came to livelihood, I asked my Rabbi this question. And so he said, you got to put your best foot forward, right? You got to do something for parnasa. You got to put your best foot forward. So I said, all right, but what about what the Vilna Gaon says? Right? He's an 8th generation descendant to the Vilna Gaon, to Elijah Vilna. So I asked him, what about, he holds that a person on, very high level, they rely on God for everything, they can do it. So I said, what about the Gaon says? He says, you got to put your best foot forward. He said, nobody's holding by that today. You got to put your best foot forward. Right? So again, if we know there's a consensus, we're not relying on miracles. If somebody relies on God 100%, again, there's nobody to it, but if someone would rely on God 100%, they don't put their best foot forward for anything, whether it's making a living, whether it's for illness or whatever, then you automatically have an obligation to go to the doctor, do whatever you can to preserve life. Yeah. But if somebody's terminally ill, right, one aspect of this is if they're terminally ill, then there wouldn't be an obligation. There may not be an obligation to do anything heroic here to preserve life, because there's no point. We're going to die anyway, right? Whether it's in 2 months, 4 months, within a certain amount of time, it's very clear they're going to die, right? We're not relying on miracles here. So now a tracheotomy is supposed to improve the patient's condition, right? In other words, it's going to give them the ability to breathe, hopefully a real chance to recovery. Then it would seem there's an obligation to do so, right? Because there's a real chance of recovery. Now, if the patient, as we said before, if the patient in general is terminal, or the intervention painful, extremely painful, burdensome, right? Or the outcome is poor. In other words, very low chance they're gonna live very long afterwards, right? And they're gonna suffer. So then, Jewish law would say you're not obligated, and it'd be better not. Now, what about what the patient wants? Maybe we don't care what the patient wants. Maybe we just say, you look at what's in front of us. Now, if a patient is cognizant, what's going on, they have what to say. Or if they sign a proxy, whatever, they have what to say. Either do this, don't do this, or have someone advocate for them. Right? They've already made someone an advocate for them. Right? The problem's going to be, where the person advocating, let's say, wants to go according to Jewish law, and the doctors in the hospital care less. Yeah, you're taking up an extra bed. It's extra money. You're not going to live anyway, or you're not going to have quote unquote quality of life. They'll try and convince the patient to do X, Y, or Z. And there can be fights. There are organizations that help this, that help a person fight for what we're going to call quality of life, real quality of life. Yeah. Or not. Or you say, you don't do heroics over here, right? So now the question is, are you always going to be obligated? Not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. But if a person decides, right, if a person, I shouldn't say decides, really wrong thing here. If a person, is going to, let's say they've already done it. The trach's already in, right? They are already, let's say on a, respirator. So respirator is another issue, whether you have the right to pull the plug right, or not, obviously, you're gonna ask top rabbinic authorities here what to do, etc. But the problem becomes when it's already been done, right? This is the problem because it's already been done. The person's now breathing on their own, which is good. But again, let's say the person, in the case I know about, a person can't move, they're paralyzed, right? And even though they're paralyzed, they're still alive. They can smile. Hard for them to talk because they have trachea, but they're there, right? The obvious thing here is if you take it out, they're breathing on their own now. Now, if they wouldn't be breathing on their own, then that's a whole question, right? Let's say they'd be on a respirator, and the only thing keeping them alive, right, is the respirator. But essentially, they're not there, right? So, right, then there's a whole discussion: can I take them off or not? Yeah. In this case, anything direct in general. Again, these are just generalities. In general, if you would pull the trach out, if you would take it out, the person will suffocate. Right? We're talking about where the person's alive. They're not brain dead, right? Difference of opinion whether you go after the brain or after the heart. Yeah. That's a whole discussion of itself. But in general, person, in this case, person's alive. Person can see, person can hear, person can smile. They might not be able to talk because they got the trach in. Okay. But essentially, they're alive. Yeah. They may never walk again. Okay. I mean, it's a tragic thing. There's no question. There's no question. But I would say that, someone's going to say, well, that's not life. Okay. But is the person alive or not? They're alive. Is it ever going to change? Is their situation going to change? Doesn't seem like. Doesn't seem like. Now, that being the case, some could argue wrongly, but they can say that's not a way to live. Well, so what do you do? That's not called quality of life. Yeah. Problem is we don't give a rat's tail, what a person thinks quality of life is or not. Person's alive. There's no question the person's alive. Person understands things. Yeah, the mind works. The body is, kind of compromised. Right? Understatement. The body's compromised. Now, the body being compromised, person can't move. Yeah. Person may never be able to walk. Right? That's probably going to be the case. Person probably will never walk. Okay. Now, if you were to ask before, should I put this trach in or not? And the consensus is this person will never get up. They'll never be able to function regularly again. That's a very different question. That's like saying they're terminal. Again, it doesn't mean they're going to die today or tomorrow. It could be prolonged. Okay. Do I have to go to the extent to do that? Now, what happens if you don't? Person has trouble breathing. What happens if you don't? They'll probably die. Most likely, they'll probably die. So again, that gets into the whole question. If there's no chance of recovery in general, yeah, and they're going to be prolonged in this state, doesn't mean I have to do this. Yeah. In other words, you're not taking an active role. But if you don't do that, they may end up dying. Okay. But what the difference is, once you've already done it. Once you've already done it, now the person breathing on their own, let's say. The breathing's a lot easier. Now, they're not taking it out yet, let's say. Yeah. But now they're able to breathe. It's easier. Am I allowed to take the person off? Right? That's essentially the question. Right? Similar, I think, to a to a ventilator. Right? Or whatever. Similar thing. Why? Because once you take it out, the person will probably die. Now, if it's artificially keeping them alive, okay, person in a coma, let's say. So now the question is, are they really alive or not? They can, they can tell, if they're brain dead or not. They'll be able to tell you that. But even what they tell you, I just, heard a number of stories firsthand from the people themselves. A person, it was a young adult, got in a very bad car accident, and they're in a coma, right? It's also a big difference, right? This person's alive, he's not in a coma, right? Person was in a coma, and family didn't know what to do. It wasn't coming out of the coma, right? So they were discussing among themselves, what should they do? What should they do? Should they terminate? Pull them off, pull off the respirator, or not. So the end of the story is this person came out of it. Person miraculously came out of it. But the person themselves said the following. They were there. They were unconscious. Doesn't matter. They heard everything. They heard all the conversation. So when this person, unconscious, heard all these conversations, he was screaming to the top of his lungs. Nobody heard him because he was unconscious. Yeah. I'm still alive. Don't kill me. I'm still here. But according to modern medicine, it wasn't there. He's in a coma. Yeah. What does that mean to be in a coma? You're not conscious. Now the question is, what does that mean? Not conscious and possibility you come back or not? And they said, I think the doctors even said, if the person would come back, what's the point? Probably a vegetable, this and that. Why would you even want that? So why would you even pray for that? But again, sometimes there's no bedside manner over here. Whatever. This is a harsh reality, right? But what did the person say? Right? What did the person say? The person says, I was alive. I heard everything, but no one could hear me. So you're looking at the person unconscious, eyes are closed. You think they're gone in general. Let's say in this case, gave no hope to recover. Okay. So you think the person eventually just going to die. But that person was very much alive. Right? Tell you one other story. Told the story before. Somebody was on a respirator and they decided to pull the plug for whatever reason. And the person's been on a respirator for a while. They pull the plug. What happens? The person dies. Person dies. That night, the doctor has a dream. The soul of this person came to this doctor in a dream. Now, how do I know? Because the doctor was telling the story. The doctor says, what was the dream? The soul came to him and said, you murderer, you killed me. I was lying there. I only had a few more days, a few more weeks, whatever it was. I could have gone straight into paradise, straight into Gan Eden, right? The Garden of Eden. That was my suffering. That was my atonement. And you killed me. You murdered me. Doctor, all shaken up from this dream. All shaken up from this dream. But the family said that's what you should do. Okay, but he did it. Yeah, it doesn't matter who tells him what to do, whatever. He did the action. What was the action? He killed him. That was the action. Murder. Guy doesn't know what to do. Wakes up in a sweat. Next night, same thing. Same dream. Soul comes to him. You murdered me. I was sitting there waiting. I could have gone into paradise. And like this, the soul was angry. Soul was very angry. Now, normally, someone would say, dreams don't mean anything. Dreams normally don't mean anything. Okay. Maybe true. In general, this is significant. A dream like this is significant. This is not something you push away. This doctor had the same dream again, right? Twice. He had this dream. Eventually, this doctor was Jewish, not religious. Eventually, this brought him to repent. This brought him to become an Orthodox Jew. Now, how do I know? Because I told the story. I heard the story. What's the moral over here? So don't kill anyone. That's part of the moral. Well, what's the moral over here? What we see, I mentioned this many, many times. What we see with our own eyes, we don't understand. Somebody lying there, say, oh, it doesn't see, doesn't hear. You don't know. You have no idea what's going on. Now, sometimes it is permissible. Take the person off. I mean, you need big, big shoulders for that, to make that decision. There are big experts in these type of things. I don't have to be one of them. Yeah, but, there are times it would be permissible. Okay. But at a time where it's not permissible, the factor of quality of life sort of goes out the window. It's a question, can the person recover? Now, they may claim that's what they mean by quality of life. Okay. Yeah. If there's a good chance a person could recover, good. So then it's worth it to do. If the person's terminal, then you wouldn't do it. Most likely you wouldn't do it. Yeah. Doing something, in a passive way, that's one thing. You're not actively doing something, right? The Gemara says, it talks of a case where someone had the opportunity to get medicine, whatever reason, they didn't. They didn't do it. They didn't go after the medicine. So the question is, if they didn't go after the medicine, they heal themselves, and then they die, is that suicide? Yeah, normally we say, suicide is something where a person does it actively. For a person, Kevorkian back in the day, that was suicide. Self-assisted, whatever, that's suicide. Yeah. So that's a different issue. That's active. If you don't do something, whether you could have or not, doesn't matter. But a person chose, I'm not taking this medicine. I don't want to take this medicine. Okay. Is not taking the medicine where it's going to cause the person to deteriorate, or whatever, and then it could cause them to die. Is that suicide? Not suicide. Why not? Because it's not something active. They're just choosing not to do something. That's very different than actively doing something and then this termination. That's a very big difference. Very, very big difference. None of us have to be in this situation. It happens. People get in these situations. And then what to do, right? But again, there are two things here. Maybe they're intertwined here, but there are two things. One is, what does Jewish law have to say? That's one thing, right? And the second thing, which in some ways I would say it's a totally separate issue, right? And that is quality of life. The question is the person going to recover or not? Okay, that's one thing. Is it terminal? Okay. But when they get up and move and this and that, but they're alive, doesn't necessarily give someone the right to say, well, we're not going to treat you. Right? They can make that decision. That's one thing. But they've already been treated, let's say. Right? Now, to pull something out, which literally is going to kill them, within a short amount of time, that's a problem. That's murder. I was in a mourner's house many years ago. And the kids say, our father was suffering, tremendous suffering. So they cut off his pacemaker. I asked the doctor there, I said, if they didn't cut off the pacemaker, was he going to die? Yes. Clearly the person was going to die. I said, okay. They cut off the pacemaker, what happened? He said they killed him quicker. He died, sorry, let's say better. He died quicker. They didn't say anyone killed him. He died quicker. Instead of dying in 6 hours, he died in 2 hours. What's the problem? You just hasten someone's death. By hastening someone's death, that's murder. Now, it goes the other way. Let's say somebody's chopping wood and the person, is terminally ill, but it's stopping them from dying. You tell the person, stop chopping the wood. Right? It goes the other way also. Right? You're stopping them from dying. You have to allow them to die. Okay. right? Again, it's very complex, but the thing, that is problematic, across the board, is this idea: what is life? What is quality of life? Like, someone said, well, something turned off in this person's brain. They can't even play Sudoku, i.e., to say that a person can't play Sudoku, that's not quality of life. I mean, they weren't saying that directly. I'm inferring that, but when someone says, well, this person can't even play Sudoku, what does that tell you? Yeah, what do they mean? They say, can't do regular things like playing Sudoku. So that gives you a right to terminate. Because of that, what happened in that case? The person, forget about Sudoku, whatever, person had a massive stroke, gave up the will to live. So what happened? Barely ate, barely drank. 2-3 months later in hospice, died. Now, that's conscious choice. It's not suicide. They choose they don't want to live. Not doing something active, they're doing something passive. Okay. Similar thing, somebody has a kidney transplant. 25 years later, the other kidney fails. They're not up for a kidney transplant, and they have to go on dialysis. Dialysis is very painful, right? It takes a lot of time also. Drains a person. They don't want to live on dialysis. So what happened? They didn't do dialysis. Now what happens when you don't get this stuff out of your system? You don't go on dialysis. Very simple, you'll die. That's what happened. 2 months later, they died. Yeah, so I asked my Rabbi this question. I asked him, is that called suicide? And he said, no. Why not? I asked to be a world expert in these things, as a lot of other things. But I asked him, why not? Because he said, you don't have an obligation. You don't, you're doing something passively, not active. So therefore, if it's passive, they say they don't want to go through the pain. They don't want to go through extra suffering. They don't have to. If they choose to, they can. Now, in that case, this person, could they have lived a number of years afterwards? Sure. Could have. They don't want to live in that way. Okay. For them, that's not quality of life. That's their choice. That 100% is their choice. The question is, if they do it, they die from it months later, is that active or passive? Is that suicide? Not suicide. Because a person doesn't have to go through extra suffering. And there are cases where a person would rather die than go through extra suffering. Yeah. There's a question the Gemara says when the 400 children were taken captive by Rome. And they were on the way to Rome. They knew they were going to be abused. So what do they do? What do these children do? At one point, they all jumped overboard and drowned. Now, the Gemara there does not say in any way, shape, or form that's suicide. And that's something that should be condemned. They did not want to go through extra suffering. By not wanting to go through extra suffering, they're allowed to. So I remember, so my Rabbi told me, he said, yeah, you see that clear. And he brought me that case as proof. So I said, okay, I have one question. I said, on that Gemara, it's a homiletic Gemara, right? Tell the story. You don't necessarily learn Jewish law from these stories. Sometimes you do, right? But I said the Rambam doesn't say anything over here. The Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, does not say anything over here. Yeah. If they want to bring a proof, that's how we hold. Then a person doesn't want to suffer, they don't have to, based on that. I said, but the Code of Jewish Law doesn't say it. He goes, that's what it means. That's what he told me. He goes, that's what it means. Doesn't matter if that's not there or not. That's what the halacha is. You don't have to go through extra suffering. So there are cases that's okay. Yeah. Yeah. What about the people on Masada? Similar question. They don't want to get killed or abused or whatever, so they kill themselves. Okay, we can't, very hard to judge these cases ourselves. But the question is, they don't want to go through something worse. They don't want to suffer worse. So what they do, they took their own lives. Yeah, but, a little bit different issue. A little bit different issue. Let me take some questions here. Somebody asks, so it's not suicide for a millionaire to refuse to accept a new heart. So the financial cost. That's an idiot, right? If he's citing the financial cost and he's got a lot of money, right? If he decides he doesn't want to do it, even if it's going to prolong his life, that's his choice. But if he's going to say, I don't want to pay for it, and he's got the money, that's kind of silly. That's kind of silly. Yeah. Some people will do all kinds of things to be able to live. Even if something so far-fetched is going to give them extra few months to live. Some people won't do it. It has nothing to do with the expense. They don't want to go through it. They don't want to go through it. So they don't have to. But if this millionaire claimed, it's about money, well, it's probably more than that. You're not just being a miser and saying, well, I don't want to pay $300,000, and he's got plenty of money. I don't want to pay the money to get, to get a heart. That's not what he's saying, though. I don't think that's what he's saying. Doesn't want to do it. That's just using an excuse why he doesn't want to do it. Right? But if that would be the only reason, again, he doesn't have to do it. In either case, the reason is silly, but essentially, if he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't have to do it. Yeah, regardless of whatever reason he gives. Yeah, it's just kind of a silly reason, but I can imagine that's the only reason. He's giving an excuse why he doesn't want to do it. Yeah. You can say what? Someone be a miser and not to save their life? People do all kinds of crazy things. Yeah. But he doesn't have the will to live. He doesn't want to go through it. So he throws that out and he says, yeah, I'm not going to do it because, I don't want to spend the money. Well, you're going to die. So, okay, so I'll die. But that's the bottom line. He doesn't have the will to live. Because if he had the will to live, he'd do it. Right? Why wouldn't he do it? Because he's got a mental block about money. Maybe he's got a huge mental block about money. Maybe this guy is a total miser. Doesn't spend money on anything. Well, he's not going to spend money to save his life. Across the board, he's like that. Okay. So he's got some sort of, mental health issue over here. Okay. But at the end of the day, he doesn't want to live. That's what I would say. He doesn't want to live. If he wanted to live, the expense he would do. He's just using that as an excuse, I think. He's using that, in my opinion. I think he's using that as an excuse. Because otherwise, he would do it. If he didn't have the money, you don't have the money, what do you do? Try and raise the money. But that means you want to live. That means you want to live. And there are people, if they have a lot of money, let's say, they don't want to die. They'll do whatever it takes until you can't do anything else. That's what you do in general, unless you don't have the will to live. You don't want to go through it. You don't go through the pain, right? Which you don't, by the way, you don't have an obligation to do. God's not going to judge you and say, hey, you could have lived another 20 years. You could have done this, that, and the other thing, but you chose not to. God's not going to judge you on that. Because no one has to be a hero over here. A person feels they can't do it. A person doesn't want to go on dialysis. Anyone's ever been on dialysis? No, a few people have been on dialysis. It's painful. Painful, takes a lot of time. Yeah. So say, it's very hard to live that way. Okay. I'm not here to judge. Right? But if a person decides, I'm not going to live that way, and there is no other way, unless you get a new kidney, but you can't get a new kidney. Yeah. In this case, you're not liable to get a new kidney. Okay. So then you're stuck. But can't dialysis, over a period of time keep you alive? Can keep you alive. 100%. Not going to be pretty, but it'll keep you alive. Does a person have to go through that to extend their life? No. They don't have to go through it if they don't choose to. But remember, if they don't do it, what's going to happen? They'll die. And that's what happened. This person died. Right? Rabbi told me straight. I asked him this question. I said, is that suicide? He said, no. He said, a person doesn't have to go to the nth degree to save themselves. To save themselves. They don't want to suffer. Suffering. Who says you have to go through extra suffering? Yeah, this is probably 20 years ago, more. This story. So, who says you have to go through that extra suffering? And you see different cases where people didn't want to go through extra suffering. They died. And with suicide, even. Yeah, with suicide. but we don't look at it as suicide, in general. That's what I'd answer on that. What if you have cancer and you commit suicide? It's okay to prevent suffering. Keep in mind one thing: let's say it's cancer. They're terminal, 100% terminal. Now, it's a very severe prohibition for Jews and non-Jews. But let's say, what's the punishment for a Jew if a Jew does that? In general, the punishment is you don't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. There are no mourning customs. You don't get up at resurrection of the dead. Now, it's a very severe prohibition, but all that probably doesn't apply. Because if someone's going to do it to that extent, there's a mental health issue. Now, you're not telling me a mental health issue over here. You're telling me they don't want to suffer, right? So if they're doing it because they don't want to suffer, then it's not suicide. That wouldn't be suicide in that case. Yeah, but today, in any case, we're going to look at the individual, even if they did it. Certainly they didn't want to suffer more. We don't look at it as suicide. And today, for sure, most people who do such a thing will be buried in a Jewish cemetery. There are mourning customs for them. That probably is not an issue because they don't want to suffer. Yeah. So, what about self-assisted suicide, right? Mr. Corky, back in the day. Right? Now, if he's directly doing it, even if the person wants it, that's murder. It's still murder, what he's doing. If the person does it themselves, they don't want to suffer. Again, it's probably underneath this case. Very hard to say when a person commits suicide, in general, that they're in the right minds. In general, right? Either they're not in the right minds totally, some mental health issue, right? Or they don't want to suffer. So if they don't want to suffer. Now, again, God's going to judge it the way he sees it. But, you see from these kids that jump overboard, they don't want to suffer. They don't want to be abused. Gemara doesn't say it's suicide. A woman who knows, let's say, she's going to get raped and abused and this and that, could she commit suicide? She could. Save her from worse embarrassment, worse suffering. Absolutely. Yeah, we don't look at it as suicide. Definitely don't look at it as suicide. So in this case also, probably the same thing. Right? Probably the same thing. Let's say you affirm you had no obligation to take a new heart. Yeah. Otherwise, unjustified, his choice is not against God. No. It's not a rebellion over him. Again, remember one thing. Most times today, when people are going to do something, even if it is quote unquote a rebellion against God, it's only based on desire. Right? 99% of all things are based on desire. People can say, I'm an atheist and I was spitting God's face and this and that. They don't know anything, right? So it's based on trying to cover their tracks on what they want to do and how they want to live their lives, right? So it's based on desire, right? Again, person can use any excuse and say, I don't want to put this hard in. You can say, I don't want to pay for it. Yeah. Now, what if someone else would pay for it? Would he do it? Maybe he's going to say it's a principle. It's a principle. It's too expensive, so I'm not going to do it. And a person's a fool. Okay, but they don't have to. Right? In other words, they can make up any excuse they want, but what's the bottom line? They don't want to do it. They don't have any interest in doing it. Yeah, if they don't have any interest in doing it, again, you don't have to go that far. Right? Right? You definitely don't have to go that far. That's what I would say. Someone says child being abused for a long time. Yeah, the moment of killing himself. Okay, they don't want to suffer. They go through extra suffering. We can't judge that. Is his choice justified? Listen, there are people who've grown up in crazy situations, tremendously crazy situations. Somehow they came out of it. I'm not going to say in a normal way, but they came out of it. Other people are suffering so bad, the humiliation so bad. Yeah. In the Orthodox Jewish community, you hear of teens committing suicide. You have many teens committing suicide. It's a horrific thing. Yeah, drug overdoses, other things, right? Someone in the field, I've heard this person say it many, many times. Yeah, 95% of the time, or just about 100% of the time, the reason any of these teenagers will commit suicide is because they've been abused. They've been sexually abused. And either people look the other way, either whatever, any number of things. Humiliation from it, whatever. Yeah. Almost 100% of the time. Again, this is someone in the field for like 20 years. That any teen suicide in the Orthodox Jewish community is because of that. Just about every single time. Yeah, there's a lot of things that go with that. Embarrassment, humiliation, all kinds of things. Right? Now, that young adult, not a child, but that young adult who's liable for their actions. God's going to say, well, that's suicide, huge reports in the world to come. Look what happened over here. Very hard to say. Very, very hard to say. It's tragic. Very, very tragic. But as far as I understand, in all these cases, they had a proper Jewish burial. Even though they committed suicide. Yeah. So it's all looked at as suicide. They're in pain. Okay, they made a choice. Very good, but look what they had. Look what they went through. I'm not here to judge. I do know some people have been abused, they came out of it. I mean, probably still in therapy, whatever, but somehow they came out of it. Other people, just jump off a cliff. It's a horrific thing. But because, if someone's gone through such trauma, you can't say. Very hard to say, in God's world, well, sorry, even though this is what happened for whatever reason, your soul had to go through it, or whatever it is, so you had to go through it, okay. And so you're not going to have a portion of the world to come because you had to go through this. That's very hard to say. Now, again, can some people overcome it? Probably. But again, many of these cases is what happens. He said probably almost 100% of the time. There's some level of abuse. Somewhere. They're not going to commit suicide as a young adult for no reason. For no reason. Right? That has to be something that penetrated that. Just gave them, just like they fell into a total abyss. Things do not happen in a vacuum. Yeah. So, based on that, to say God's gonna judge, God's gonna judge them, not have a portion of the world to come for us. You say, but aren't they responsible for their actions? They are. 100%. They're responsible. But, in this case, they've gone through trauma. Can't judge them. Right? We're never right to judge them. And again, as far as I understand, in all these cases, not one did not have a proper burial. Did not have a Jewish burial. They all had Jewish burials. Right? So in that sense, we're probably very, lenient in this case. It's a horrific thing, but when it comes to mourning and all that, you do that. You do that for such a case. So it's all looked at as suicide. I mean, it's tragic. Like, there's no question. Somebody asks, so I'm going to deal with this question now. Somebody asks, one second. Somebody asks, what are my thoughts on the Mossad? Sort of a different related question, but it's okay. That's what this Q&A is for. What are my thoughts on the Mossad? Yeah, so you need a spy network. I don't think there's any question. Certainly for the state of Israel, right? You need spies all over the place. Now, sometimes they're going to do things. They're going to be contrary to Jewish law, right? Okay. Could be you could look at it as, doing things for the sake of the greater good, depending how far it goes and depending what it is, in general. But, as as an organization that's trying to help the Jewish people, right, in the land of Israel, again, everything's in the hands of God. You got to remember that, but you got to put your best foot forward. So, you see what they pulled off against Hezbollah and things they've done in Iran. I mean, it's pretty ingenious. I mean, obviously God helping them along the way. Yeah, you can't take God out of the picture here, right? But it can go either way. If they're doing good things, they're trying to protect the state, very good. If they're doing underhanded things that are, manipulating things and doing things that are contrary to what they should, then yeah, then that would be a problem. That's with anything. That's with anything. But it doesn't mean everything's permitted. You got three cardinal sins you have to give up your life for any time, any place: murder, idolatry, and immorality. So if they have to like sleep around with non-Jewish women or whatever in order to get information, that's kind of a problem. That we don't say everything's permissible over here. Say, oh, it's pikuach nefesh. You're saving lives. Well, doesn't give you the right to do whatever you want. But that's the best way to get information. I know. I'd say everyone has to ask their own, local Orthodox rabbi what to do. What happens if you have to kill people? Can a person be a police officer? You end up killing people, let's say. Okay, you have to. You're putting your life in danger. Good. Right? Good question. But again, just like in the time of King David, you need a standing army. So you need a standing army. You need people to do this. Yeah, absolutely. You need people to do this. Right? So even if they kill people, okay, there's a greater good over here. Within reason. Within reason. You got to be moral also, to a certain extent. You try not to kill, quote unquote, innocent people. Whatever. You do your best, but, you do whatever it takes. I just heard someone say that, when with the Iran war, somebody had said, Iran, you're targeting our civilians, we're going to target your civilians. Right? So someone said, obviously kind of a foolish thing to say, right? You don't want to target civilians, but it's, if they're going to use civilians as human shield, you end up killing people, quote unquote, innocently. Okay, it's part of war. You don't advocate we're going to kill innocent people. We're going to kill civilians. Obviously, it's a bad thing to say. It makes you look bad, right? You don't want to, show you're so macho and say, oh, look, we're going to kill civilians like you killed ours. We'll kill yours, right? That you can't do. But there are casualties. In war, there are casualties. So will sometimes, quote unquote, innocent people get killed? Yeah. That's part of war, right? In this case, someone sets up to kill somebody. Yeah. And, wife and kids are around. They try not to kill them when the wife and kids are around. If they have no choice, it's a golden opportunity. Okay, you do whatever it takes. Is that murder? No. It's not murder. Why not? Because you got to do what you got to do whatever it takes. Right? It's better not to. Better be, as moral as possible. Right? To get a clean shot, take it. Families around. Okay. Right? But in many instances, people will not want to do that because, family's a different thing. You take the person when they're not with family. But the problem is, if always hanging out with family and whatever, and they have these human shields, what are you going to do? Sometimes you have to do it. Sometimes. I'm not saying all the time. That's not the goal. That's not the end goal. It's for sure not the end goal. Right? But if you have to, you have to. Right? This is war. So again, again, I'm speaking in generalities. There are things that would be outrightly forbidden. No question. But again, if it's am I going to say it's for the sake of a greater good, it's always permissible? No, not always. Sometimes it would be. Right? It depends. Again, like anything else, depends on the case. That is what I would say. On that, someone here says, question related to modesty. Okay. Two well-known Orthodox Sephardic female influencers. Ooh. On Instagram and YouTube. Both are married. Don't let their full face be shown in their content. Okay. Yeah, should Orthodox Sephardic women not show their face fully on social media for a reason of sneeze? Yeah. Their magazines, they're Jewish magazines, they don't have any pictures of women. These can be famous Jewish women, doesn't matter. They don't have on purpose pictures of women. Yeah. So I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. Yeah. What about women? I spoke about this before. What about women singers? Yeah, let's say they put up songs on YouTube, yeah, and they say, men shouldn't watch, Jewish men shouldn't watch it. That doesn't help. That's a problem. It's putting a stumbling block in front of them. Yeah, what if they sell their own discs, or back in the day they had tapes or whatever? Okay, they can do that, but they say on the tape itself this is only for women. That gets them out of a problem. Yeah, what's the problem? The problem is man is not allowed to listen to a woman sing. He doesn't know who she is. Yeah, even if he doesn't see her, even better. If he sees her, it's also a problem. Yeah. So yeah, is it better that they don't? Sure, 100%. They'll put a stumbling block in front of other people. But whatever. It's a problem with all these things. With all these things with social media. Obviously, better not. They shouldn't be on social media. I'm not saying men should be on social media either, right? I'm not going to discriminate. Yeah, but there are modesty things also. But a person can make good money if they're a good influencer. They have a lot of people. People pay a lot of money for it. Someone has got a large following. And they're going to back whatever they say. Let's say better. They're going to back their product. If someone has, let's say, 10 million followers, 5 million followers, or something like that, that's pretty good. Yeah. So what they say can have an effect on your business because they endorse it. So it's not a small thing here. But yeah, you gotta be careful. So yeah, for modesty reasons, they wouldn't do it that way. I agree. I think that's a good thing. But again, all these things, when it comes to modesty, you gotta be very careful. Very, very careful. What we do in general. What said I heard a rabbi say that women not post any pictures of videos. Yeah, right, because men sin to these images. Yeah, it's called with neighbor, right? It's putting a stumbling block. They can be dressed 100% modestly. Okay, that's great. Problem is, it's putting a stumbling block in general. If they were dressed not in a modest way, it's even worse. 100%. Interesting enough, doesn't apply to non-Jews. I mentioned this before. Even a non-Jew non-Jewish woman doesn't dress modest and guys look or whatever. The guy still transgresses, for sure. Yeah, but there aren't really, there are I would say there are basic modesty issues, but there's no with neighbors, no putting a stumbling block in front of someone by a non-Jew. Right? Is it a good thing to do? No. Certainly not a good thing to do. But they don't transgress what do you call it? They don't transgress putting a stumbling block in front of them. Someone says, I went into it on my social media. Yep, it's a good thing. That's definitely a good thing. Whatever. Some people need social media for whatever reason, but probably better not. It's probably better not to have it. It's probably a big waste of time. Yeah, and probably a lot of stumbling blocks through it anyway. Not just the way people dress, but what they talk about also. Right? Most of the things being Russian horror and other things that would be forbidden. 100% would be forbidden. Yeah. Any other questions? The end of life issues are hard. Very, very hard. And like we said before, people shouldn't have to go through them. You have to go through them. Okay, you have to know, what the basic things are, and what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. But sometimes you're out of control. What happens if a person has siblings and they have greater control, right? I know of a story of somebody that the parent was going to be cremated, and they fought tooth and nail. They were able to stop it. Not in every case you're able to stop, right? Not in every case. And sometimes, like, you do what you can do, right? That's general. That's what I was told many years ago. You do whatever you can do to make sure people don't get killed, right, or cremated. And if you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice. You do what's possible. You do what's possible. Someone asked, we say, Anenu, we're going to, if we individually fast. Yeah, individual fast, 1 second. Individual fast, you would say it. You would say it in the afternoon service, not in the morning service. You say it in the afternoon service, not in the morning service. What if you have cancer and commit suicide? Is it okay? I answered that. Someone asked, you married before converting, divorced? Do you still have to cover your hair? No. No obligation. No obligation. Again, even if it wasn't a legal marriage and they live together, right? So it's noahide, that's a legal marriage. If they live together, person walks out, that's considered divorce. But even if it's done legally, it doesn't matter, right? You don't have an obligation to cover here. I know some people that will. Some people say, whether widowed or divorced or whatever, they're still going to cover their hair. Okay. Yeah, I will tell you, a rabbinical court's going to ask you on that. They're going to call you on that. And they're going to tell you absolutely have no obligation whatsoever. And you probably shouldn't do it. You say, but I'm never going to get married anyway. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I mean, they're not going to say if you do it, the conversion is not valid. Not going to go that far. Yeah, but if a person got divorced, there's no, there's no obligation whatsoever. No obligation. Now, a person says, I want to do it. Okay. You can make that choice. You can make that choice. But, when a rabbinical court asks your status and they say, I'm going to get a divorce, they're going to ask you. Is it, I told somebody that and they asked it. They asked them. I said, or let's say better. I told someone that a rabbinical court is going to ask you. That's wow, it's so interesting because they did. And this other rabbi asked me the same thing. I said, okay, it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy, but they're going to ask you. 100% they're going to ask you. Now, if a person would say, I'm going to do it anyway, even if I have no obligation because if I feel whatever, they're not going to say you can't do it. They're not going to say, we're not going to convert you because of it. Right? But again, obligation? No, certainly not. Certainly not. Some people feel more comfortable that way. Okay. I'm not saying the person can't do it. Right? Our rabbinical court will ask you the question. I'm telling you. They will ask you the question. Right? They're not going to disqualify you for it. But they'll tell you the same thing. And if they didn't, I'd be shocked. Yeah, but they're going to tell you the same thing. Exact same thing. Mossad, okay. What if in a noahide marriage, one person travels a lot for work, lives in another country for a while? Is it divorce? No, it's not divorce. It's only considered divorce when you walk out and you're not coming back. If you're doing it for travel or this and that, that's not divorce. That's not considered divorce. Technically, you're still together. Yeah. Now, let's say, you're squabbling, you're not getting along. Yeah, that's a different issue. But it's not something final. If it's something final, the person walks out, not coming back, then yeah. Then that would be considered divorce. But in this situation, no. Either staying in the country for another while, it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. We don't look at that as being that's not divorce. If the person says, well, we're separate because we don't want to be together and this and that, okay. Still not quite divorced until person decides they're out. And they're totally separated. Any other questions here? Can you use earthenware for hand wash basin? Yes. It can be made out of anything. It shouldn't be plastic. I mean, it can be plastic. What am I saying? It could be plastic. Definitely could be plastic, right? We have these plastic things to wash your hands. 100% can be plastic. Can it be your earthenware? Yeah. 100% can be metal. It's no, it should be whole though. It shouldn't be broken. It shouldn't be broken in any way. But it certainly could be earthenware. What about the apps woman? Oh, sorry. What about for apps for women? Or hair's too fragile? The current climate previously covered her hair because of past climate. Right. Again, a person wants to do it, they can do it. Not saying not. If they want to do it. I'm just telling you, a rabbinical court will ask you the question. Because one of the questions is they're going to ask, on any application is family status. Right? So person will put their divorce, let's say. So they look at it, very good. Then they look up and they say, you're covering your hair. Why are you covering your hair? Yeah. It's not a Jewish marriage. You don't have to cover your hair. So you have to come up with an explanation why you want to cover your hair. right? Again, it's not something that will disqualify. Should not disqualify. Won't disqualify. They'll tell you straight out, you really shouldn't cover your hair. You're giving a false, it's a false statement you're making. But a person says, on the circumstances, this, that, they what, okay, they're not going to stop you. They're not going to say it's absolutely forbidden. I'm telling you, they're going to ask them. They're 100% going to ask. So if you have what to say, okay. They're not going to stop you either way. Yeah. Any other questions? Or there are people, I'll tell you, I've had people, bad marriages, this and that. They'll say, I have no intention of ever getting married. Is the rabbinical court going to convert you? They'll convert you. They'll say it's better, if you can try and get married or whatever, but, they're not going to force the issue. They're not going to force the issue and say, oh, if you intend never get married, they'll tell you it's probably better to be married. Might try and convince you, but the person's already burnt out and is dealing with it. They're not going to stop you, right? They're going to stop you, for that. Unless it's something where it's something obvious, and a person says, I'm not going to cover my hair. Where they have an obligation to cover their hair, or I'm not going to keep kosher. Like, I'm going to do everything, but I'm not going to do this. That's a different issue. That they won't convert you. That's a different issue. Or if it's hard for a person, they'll say it's hard for me. Okay, that's not disqualifying. Yeah, but a person outrightly says I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z. That's a problem. That's for sure a problem. Somebody asked how about a giant headband? That's not a problem, right? That's definitely not a problem. A person, so a person won't sweat or whatever. Not a problem. Again, we're talking about covering your entire hair, not with the doily, not one of these things that have holes in it, whatever. And a woman puts it on her head when she walks in the synagogue. That doesn't do anything, right? That it doesn't cover the hair. They'll say, well, it's the thought that counts. Well, it's either you cover the hair, or you don't cover the hair. And someone will say, well, I've seen one Orthodox women that wear a baseball cap and all their hair is hanging out. Okay. They say, isn't that forbidden? Yes. Why they do it? Go ask them. They'll say, I'm covering my hair. The only permissibility if you're going to cover your hair, right? So let's say a hand's breadth of hair came out. Okay, that's one thing. To leave it out at the outset, that's a different issue. Says you're allowed to do that. Your entire hair has to be covered. Should be covered. So again, Kaufman's law is going to be either you do it right or you don't bother. Right? Isn't it better if someone does something than nothing? It depends. Depends where they're coming from. If they're growing, they're learning this, that, okay. It's hard for them. Good. Eventually they'll get there. Yeah, but if someone says, well, that's our standard and that's what we do and blah, 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 that's a problem. It's a problem. No other good way to put it. That's definitely a problem. Yeah. Any other questions? Someone asks, does the rabbinical court recognize a noahide marriage without being legally married? Doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Yeah. They are going to, or let's say better. If they live together, they again in the states, in certain states, it's common law marriage. Right? Not all states, but certain states of common law marriage. Right? So a person can claim I'm living common law marriage, right? Which is like a noahide marriage. Yeah. That's not gonna matter. That's not gonna matter. The most important thing is that a person's together and they want to convert, both have to be on the same page, exact same page. The other person can't say, I back you, I'm happy for you, but I'm not going to do it. Then they're not going to accept it. Doesn't matter whether you're legally married or not, they won't accept it. Right? You won't be able to convert. If you're both on the same page exactly, fine. Right? But it's really irrelevant whether a person, lives together or they don't. Whether it's legal or not, doesn't matter. That doesn't matter to them. And once a person converts, let's say, they're going to have a Jewish marriage. Very good. Who says you have to have secular marriage according to where you live? Now, some people say it's better to do it for taxes and for other things. Okay, But you have an obligation to be married legally according to the state? No. According to Jewish law, you have an obligation, that's for sure. According to the state, no. Yeah. According to the state, no. Do they convert both at the same time? They should. I mean, if they're both ready to convert, then they'll convert at the same time. If the rabbinical court feels one's more ahead or, than the other, they still may convert both at the same time, or they'll tell you to wait. They'll tell you to wait a few months or whatever. But usually they'll convert at the same time. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to stop here. I do this every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock Eastern time, 5 o'clock Israel time. Anyone has any questions, you can find me on Facebook. And actually, I just changed my Facebook page to Michael Kaufman for whatever, to verify things. So whatever, go back to Michael Kaufman at some point. Or Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on Facebook, or Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube, or orthodoxconversion.com. And on my YouTube channel, I got Q&As, Ethics My Father, it's Bobo Vidikish, want to send me an email, Rabbi Chaim Kaufman at gmail.com, RBBI.